I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today I continue with section 5.4 of Coup D'Etat by Edward Luttwak. I'm continuing with chapter 2, When is a Coup D'Etat Possible? Political independence. It is impossible to seize power within a state if the major source of political power is not there to be seized. The 1956 Hungarian Revolution, for example, was totally successful, and the leaders of the revolution quickly found themselves in control of all the traditional instruments of power: the armed forces, the police, the radio, and the communication facilities. The one thing that could not be seized in the streets of Budapest happened to be the major source of power to the previous regime: the presence of the Soviet army in and around Hungary. These armed forces, vastly superior to the Hungarian army, were a greater source of power to a Kremlin-backed government than any element within the country. The control of the Red Army was in Moscow, thus the revolution would only have succeeded if it had been carried out in Moscow, not Budapest. This dependence of one government on another is a widespread phenomenon. Although there are very few colonial states left, there are many pseudo-independent ones. In some cases, these have less real autonomy than some of the old colonies. In both East Germany and South Vietnam, the armed forces of the greater quote-unquote ally are much more powerful than those of the country itself. In both countries, the international and the domestic situations are so closely interrelated that the greater ally must have effective control over vast areas of domestic policy, even assuming that he had no wish to interfere for other reasons. The rulers of East Germany have always been very careful in ensuring the approval of the Soviet authorities for even the smallest policy changes, and each policy announcement can be traced back to a recent trip to Moscow. Similarly, in Saigon, the U.S. Embassy is generally recognized as a greater source of power than the presidential palace. In these conditions, a coup can only work with the approval of the greater ally. The first coup in Vietnam, which overthrew the unpopular Diem and the still less popular Ngo family, was carried out by men who appreciated these realities of power. When the events of Hue of 8 May 1963 resulted in a break between Diem and the Buddhists, the long-suffering generals decided to act. They sounded out the opinion of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and asked through an intermediary whether the Americans would report to Diem possible consultations on eventual changes in the prevailing political structures. Quote, when, after some considerable debate between the CIA, the Embassy, the Presidency, and the Pentagon, the U.S. authorities informed the plotters that they would not be reported to Diem, the following sequence of events took place. May 1963, beginning of intensified conflict between Buddhists and Diem. May through September, internal American debate on whether the Buddhists are neutralists to be opposed or nationalists to be supported. The final conclusion was that the Hinayana Buddhists were bad and the Mahayana Buddhists were good. October 1963. Standstill of all economic aid to Vietnam, i.e. to Diem's regime. 22 October 1963. End of direct aid by CEA to Ngo Dinh Nhuy's special forces. These were the main source of direct power to the regime, entirely financed and equipped by the CIA. 1 November 1963. Coup. 2nd of November. Death of Diem and the Ngo Dinh Nhu. The Viet Cong accused the generals and their front man, Van Minh, of being stooges of the Americans. But in their dealings with the U.S. authorities, they were merely being realistic. They saw that whatever power there was to be seized depended on the Americans. Seizing Saigon's fixtures and fittings without U.S. support would have been seizing an empty symbol. East Germany and South Vietnam are two clear cases of dependence. But there are many more countries which are in the gray area between effective independence and total submission. Ex-colonies provide many of these more subtle cases of dependence, and the presence of the former mother country is very real and very effective. Instead of large and expensive armies, there are military and economic advisors. There's economic aid, and above all, the tight web of long-established dependence in non-political arenas. Thus, schooling follows patterns originally established in colonial days. The organization of the professions follows the metropolitan system, and this is very important where the ruling elite is composed largely of lawyers, whose whole raison d'être is based on the use of a particular procedure and code of law. Trade is often largely tied to the ex-colonial power because of the hold of inherited tastes, habits, and the facts that trade links are often based on established relationships and communications. Thus, 5 years after independence, it was still necessary for adjacent ex-French and ex-British colonies to route telephone calls to Paris and London, though a direct line would have been 300 instead of 5,000 miles long. The power of these links between ex-colonies and the former colonial power varies from case to case, but quite unobtrusive ties can sometimes give sufficient leverage to the latter to prevent or oppose a coup. Thus, in 1964, the French reversed an otherwise successful coup in Gabon, without needing to use more than symbolic force. The power of the ex-colonial countries has waned from its peak in most places, but it is still considerable even in sheer military terms. Everybody remembers how a few companies of commandos stopped the mutinies in East Africa. Although the French have opted for a policy of neutrality and new coup in Gabon and elsewhere, should they want to intervene, they still retain 6,000 troops in Africa with air support and efficient equipment. 6,000 does not sound like a large force, but it is huge compared to most armies in the ex-French colonies. The Central African Republic's army, for example, numbers 500, and the average for the whole group is about a battalion per country. A very specialized type of dependence is a byproduct of modern technology and is found outside the ex-colonial sphere. This is the heavy mortgage placed on political independence by the acquisition of sophisticated weaponry, particularly aircraft. The jet fighter is the crucial case. Unlike ships and tanks, jet fighters confer an absolute advantage. Better training and morale can overcome the inferiority of equipment on the ground, but not in the air. The best pilots in the world using old generation subsonic fighters can do very little about faster aircraft. Therefore, it is vitally important for any country to match its potential rivals' aircraft. The political problem arises because A, only a few countries make jet fighters, B, the planes need a continual flow of spare parts, and C, there is a long gestation period between the original order and the time when training and ancillary equipment are sufficiently developed for operational use. Thus, if a country wants to acquire jet fighters, it has to be reasonably friendly with one of 5 countries: Sweden, the USA, France, Britain, or the USSR. Once a deal is made, it will need to stay friendly, otherwise the flow of supplementary equipment will stop. Thus, the initial purchase is followed by years of dependence. Jet fighters don't grow in economically backward countries where the whole industrial base is lacking, so that the constant updating of electronics, air-to-air missiles, radar equipment, etc. have to be imported, and from the original source to whose aircraft they are related. Both sides of the bargain recognize this dependence, and the supply of sophisticated weaponry is usually allied with the general trade, ideological, and political links. At what point is the degree of dependence sufficient to affect the feasibility of the coup? Consider the following timetable of relations between the Soviet Union and Egypt from 1955 to 1967. 1955 Czech arms deal. This was the first arms supply contract between the Soviet Union and the Arab state. It was of great political importance for Egypt because it broke the Western arms monopoly and signified true independence. Effect: the commitment of future foreign currency earnings and the need to keep on friendly terms with the only possible supplier of spare parts. 1956 Suez-Sinai War. The Egyptian defeat in the Sinai resulted in a loss of much-needed equipment. This was quickly replaced by the Soviet Union. Effect: the commitment to the USSR reinforced and financial indebtedness increased. 1962 Revolution and Civil War in the Yemen. After the death of Ahmad ibn Yahya, ruler of the Yemen, the subsequent revolution and civil war involved Egyptian-supported Republicans and Saudi-supported royalists. Egyptian troops were sent to back the Republicans. Effect: Soviet help needed to keep 30 to 50,000 troops in the Yemen. Moral and monetary debt increases. 1966 final break with USA. End of U.S. wheat shipments. The shortfall in food supplies could not be covered by hard currency purchases in the world market. Effect: Soviet food aid started, making Egypt dependent on the USSR for a significant part of its supplies. 1967 June, Six-Day War, Egyptian defeat in the Sinai. Israeli sources estimated on 20th of June that 80% of Egyptian military equipment of all kinds was destroyed or captured. Effect: as a condition for the re-equipment of Egyptian forces, the USSR required close supervision over army training, the selection of senior military personnel, and the organization of intelligence services. Thus, after 12 years of limited relationship, designed to free Egypt of its dependence on the West for arms supplies, has escalated to a much greater degree of dependence on the USSR. Egypt is now dependent on Soviet goodwill for arms, wheat, and general economic aid. The Soviet Navy has shore facilities in Alexandria and Port Said and there are several hundred Russian advisors and instructors in the Egyptian armed forces. Is this enough to allow the Soviet Union to oppose or reverse a coup? The Soviet embassy in Cairo could act as a focus of counter-coup activity. It could inspire and deploy the forces of the many Egyptians committed to the Soviet presence. It could certainly regulate appropriately the flow of aid supplies. Even after a coup, the USSR could bring about a collapse of the new regime simply by cutting off all aid. Should the regime turn to the USA for help, this will automatically mean that the opponents of the coup will be joined by the anti-American element as well. This would at least severely complicate the position of its planners, and in present circumstances, it would almost certainly lead to their defeat. When countries are in such a position of direct and material dependence, the coup must be integrated with some immediate post-coup foreign policy planning. If the political inspiration of the coup is opposed to the greater power, then the coup may well fail unless discoloration can be concealed. The few remaining colonies, largely Spanish and Portuguese, are of course formally in a position of total dependence. There too, as in South Vietnam and East Germany, no coup can succeed in situ, but would have to be carried out in Lisbon or Madrid. The second precondition of the coup is therefore, the target state must be substantially independent, and the influence of foreign powers in its internal political life must be relatively limited. It's a cliché that countries are interdependent rather than independent. Domestic political issues have international implications, while foreign political developments have domestic repercussions. The commercial, cultural, and military ties that link countries give each country a measure of influence in the affairs of the other. Even the most powerful nations can be so influenced. Thus, in the period preceding the U.S. intervention in the Second World War, British-influenced and German-influenced political groupings and pressure groups were operating in American domestic politics. Just as today, the parties in the Middle Eastern conflict exert pressure on the State Department through their respective lobbies. If even a superpower can be influenced by such weak powers, then any definition of independence must be as loose as reality. Nevertheless, some more definite guidelines can be formulated. A coup is not worth attempting if a great power has significant military forces in the country concerned. If these forces are physically remote from the political centers, and or if the pre-coup regime was moving towards an unfriendly position vis-a-vis the great power, the rule does not hold. B. The coup must seek the endorsement of the great power if large numbers of its nationals are serving as military or civilian advisors. The application of these guidelines excludes many otherwise potentially suitable targets. A. The Spanish, Portuguese, and other colonies. B. East Germany, Hungary, Outer Mongolia, and perhaps Poland. C. Thailand, Laos, South Vietnam, and D. Some of the African territories, still bound by defense agreements with France or the UK, subject to the qualifications made above and limited to the smaller countries. Thus concludes Section 5.4 of Coup D'Etat by Edward Luttwak. Still in Chapter 2, When is a Coup D'Etat Possible? Tomorrow we'll continue with Section 5.5, continuing Chapter 2, When is a Coup D'Etat Possible? I will see you then. Alam.